I got home later than usual that night. Work had dragged on, a last-minute shipping issue had me tied up for hours, and by the time I stepped through the front door, all I wanted was to change into sweatpants, maybe heat up leftovers, and just sit in the quiet. The house was dim except for the soft yellow kitchen light. I figured Jennifer was upstairs, or maybe watching one of her crime shows in the living room. But as I set my keys down, I heard her voice, loud, clear, and just a little too sharp. She was on speakerphone, talking to someone. No, more than one person. Her laugh bounced off the walls of the kitchen and into the hallway where I stood, frozen in place. It wasn't her usual laugh. It was harder, meaner. I was about to walk in and let her know I was home, but then I heard the words that hit like a punch straight to the gut. I control him with one thing. Works every time. I didn't even move. I leaned against the edge of the counter just out of sight, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. My first instinct was that I'd misheard, that maybe it was part of some story she was telling. But her tone said otherwise. It wasn't joking. It was smug, satisfied. I heard one of her friends gasp, then laugh too. Jennifer went on, saying how she'd figured me out years ago, that she just had to go quiet, make herself unavailable, maybe sleep in a guest room for a night, and I'd fall back in line, like a dog waiting for its owner's approval. She said, "He hates when I pull away. He'll start apologizing for things he didn't even do. I don't have to yell or argue, just disappear emotionally, and boom, problem solved." Every word was like a brick crashing through a window in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stood there, trying to convince myself that this was out of context, or that maybe they were joking, but there was no mistaking the pride in her voice. I knew that voice. I'd heard it before when she'd talk about people at work or gloat about getting a deal from a car salesman. It was the voice she used when she felt like she'd won something. The rest of the call played out in a blur. Her friends chimed in, calling me loyal, easy to read, and worse, soft. One of them said, "Well, if it works, it works." And Jennifer agreed. "He thinks we're just going through a phase every time. I just make him feel guilty. Works like a charm." I didn't walk in. I didn't say anything. I stood there like a statue, listening to my wife talk about me, like I was some broken tool she'd learned to manipulate. I didn't even realize how tightly I was gripping the counter until my hand started to ache. Eventually, the call ended, and I heard her footsteps going upstairs. I waited until the house was completely quiet before I finally moved. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, every word from that call replaying in my head. I thought about every argument we'd ever had, the way she'd go silent, the way she'd suddenly grow cold, distant, and how I'd always be the one to initiate peace. I blamed it on stress. I told myself she was tired or overwhelmed. But now I knew the truth. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a tactic. And it worked because I loved her, because I didn't want to lose her, because I kept thinking we were just going through tough patches, like every couple did. But to her, it was all part of a game. I lay there that night, and something shifted in me. It wasn't rage, it wasn't even sadness. It was more like watching something fall apart that you thought was solid, like realizing the foundation under your feet was hollow. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, but I didn't fall asleep either. I just kept staring into the dark, wondering how long it had been this way, and how I hadn't seen it until now. I sat on the edge of the bed, the shadows of the room stretching long across the walls, while Jennifer scrolled on her phone like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just exposed our entire marriage as a one-sided game she'd been winning for years. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My head was buzzing, spinning, trying to make sense of the words I had heard only moments earlier, but the more I tried to rationalize them, the more pieces of my past started snapping into place, like dominoes toppling one after another, and I couldn't stop them. I thought about last Christmas, when I brought up the idea of scaling back holiday spending. I'd suggested we be more mindful, nothing harsh, just responsible. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up, and when she came back that evening, she didn't say a single word. No hello, no smile, no acknowledgement, just silence. That lasted for 3 days. I apologized, even though I'd said nothing wrong. I offered to take her out, to forget the conversation. She smiled faintly then, kissed me, and told me, "See, you always come around." It wasn't a compliment. It was training. I remember the time I asked her to be more present. Just that. I told her I missed her, that I felt we weren't connecting like we used to. She looked at me like I was pathetic. Not angry, just disappointed. The next week, she was distant. Every time I reached out to touch her, she flinched just slightly, just enough for me to notice. Every dinner, she was on her phone. Every conversation ended in a short answer. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. I tried to be extra kind instead. I bought flowers, made dinner, gave her space. And then, one night, she leaned in, rested her head on my shoulder, and said, That's the you I like. I thought it was progress. I didn't know I was being rewarded. Memory after memory kept crashing into me. I remember the warmth I used to chase in her voice, the softness that had become so rare it felt like a prize. Her moods had always been unpredictable, or so I'd told myself. But now I saw the pattern. Anytime I disagreed, anytime I spoke up, there was a consequence. Not loud, not violent, but precise. Her affection was currency, and she spent it carefully. Only when she'd get what she wanted. I'd spent years telling myself we were just different, that I was more emotional, more communicative, and she was just private, reserved. That I just had to be patient. That love meant adapting, adjusting. But now, sitting there in the dark, I could see it clearly. There was no adapting. I wasn't growing alongside her. I was bending, slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until I couldn't even remember what it felt like to stand straight. I thought about how often I had explained her silence to others. She just needs space, I'd say. She's overwhelmed. It's been a stressful week. I protected her image while shrinking my own. I let my friends believe we were just private, when the truth was, I was isolated. I couldn't remember the last time I felt chosen, desired. She didn't love me openly. She allowed me to orbit her world, as long as I stayed useful, loyal, predictable. I stared at the wall across from me, the soft flicker of the hallway light barely reaching into the room. Jennifer was still beside me, scrolling, humming now, lightly tapping her foot like everything was fine, and in that moment, I understood what people meant when they said a part of them died because something in me went quiet. Not in despair, but in recognition the illusions fell away, and beneath them, I saw a man who had spent years confusing manipulation for misunderstanding. I didn't cry, I didn't clench my fists. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, letting the memories undo me, letting the truth settle like dust in an abandoned room. I had been loved in the way one keeps a favorite tool, not cherished but useful. And the moment I stopped being useful, the warmth would vanish. It already had. I didn't make a scene. I didn't pack a bag or sleep on the couch or throw accusations across the room. That wasn't my style, and it never had been. I didn't even speak about what I'd heard. Not to her. Not to anyone. I just began to move differently, like a man waking up from a long sleep and testing his own limbs again. Quietly, deliberately. The first shift was subtle. I started waking up earlier. Not to cook her breakfast or catch up on work emails like I used to, but to drive to the gym. I hadn't touched a barbell in over a year, hadn't really prioritized my health in longer than that. But I walked in that Monday morning with no fanfare, no goals to transform, just the need to feel something other than numb. I ran until my legs ached and lifted until my arms trembled. No music, no distractions, just me, my breath, and the sound of weight hitting the mat. After work, instead of rushing home to cook or wait for Jennifer to get back from her Pilates class or dinner with a friend, I started taking walks. Not long, not aimless, just enough to feel the chill air on my face and let my thoughts settle. On Saturdays, I drove out of Highbanks Metro Park and hiked the trails by myself. It wasn't about finding myself or any of that cliché nonsense. It was about feeling my own presence in a space that wasn't controlled, managed, or conditional. I finally scheduled the dentist appointment I'd been putting off for almost a year. Then the annual physical. Then the optometrist. I didn't tell her any of this. I didn't need to. These weren't shared events. These were for me. It was strange how foreign that felt at first. Doing things just because I wanted to, not because they'd benefit her plans or align with what was convenient for her schedule. She didn't notice the shift right away. Of course she didn't. She was used to me orbiting her routine, not building my own. But the first time she did notice, it was small and unremarkable on the surface, though I remember it with perfect clarity. She walked into the kitchen holding her phone, her keys dangling in her hand, and said, "Hey, Carl wants to check out that rug shop in Dublin on Saturday. You're coming, right?" I didn't look up from what I was doing. I was chopping vegetables, prepping a meal I wanted to cook. Nothing fancy, just something from a recipe I'd saved months ago and forgotten about. Calmly, I said, "I already have plans." That was all. No explanation, no guilt in my voice. Just a simple truth. She blinked. That small pause, barely a second, was everything. The confusion in her eyes, the faint furrow in her brow, it told me what I needed to know. She was used to me folding. Used to me canceling whatever I had the moment she beckoned. Used to me putting her preferences at the center of every weekend. She gave a short laugh, like she didn't believe me. "With who?" she asked. Not curious, territorial. I wiped my hands and shrugged, just something I've been meaning to do. That was it. The end of that conversation. No argument. No blow-up. She didn't press further, but I saw her shift back on her heels. Recalculating, I'd stepped off the script. That week, I went to the movies alone the week after. I turned off my phone for an entire Sunday and took a drive through Hocking Hills, stopping at diners and bookstores along the way. I didn't announce it, I didn't leave a note. I just went. I wasn't withdrawing. I was re-entering myself. After years of being cast in the role of steady husband, fixer, comforter, I was taking back the small things, my choices, my hours, my inner quiet. There was no grand plan, just an unfolding, one moment at a time. The first time she tried the silence again, I recognized it immediately, not as an emotional wound, but as a tool. The sudden cold shoulder, the way she walked through the house like I wasn't there, how she placed things down just a little louder than necessary, like punctuation for her unspoken anger. Once, that would have triggered something in me. I would have asked what was wrong, offered to fix it before I even knew what it was, begged for closeness like a man apologizing for a crime he didn't commit. But this time, I let the silence sit. I made coffee. I folded laundry. I went to work. I didn't poke at it, didn't try to thaw it. I didn't even acknowledge it. To me, it was weather. Some days are sunny, some aren't. You bring a jacket, or you don't. That's life. Her silence had once been a fog that wrapped itself around my thoughts, clouding everything. Now it was just background noise. She noticed. I saw it in the flicker of her eyes when she finally asked, too casually, "Everything okay?" I smiled and said, "Yeah, great," without even looking up from the book I was reading. That slight twitch of her jaw told me more than any argument ever had. It wasn't concern. It was confusion. I wasn't giving her what she wanted. Then came the sarcasm, little barbs dropped like bait. Comments like, "Must be nice having all that alone time," or "Don't work too hard. Your wife might forget what you look like." I used to take that as a cue to pull her in, to assure her, to try harder. This time, I let them pass. Not out of spite, but because I simply didn't know a reaction. Sarcasm without sting is just noise, and I'd stopped letting noise guide my responses. One evening, as I was finishing up some reports on the patio, she stepped out and leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning me with that familiar look. She waited for me to speak first. I didn't. Eventually, she said, "It's like you don't even care that we barely talk anymore." I paused, looked at her, calm and steady, then replied, "I'm always open to real conversations. But if you mean whatever this is, this game, I'm not playing." She rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, then stormed back inside. But I didn't follow. I didn't defend myself. I didn't chase her down the hall trying to patch a wound she didn't even name. I just went back to work, letting the dust settle on its own. Later, she tried affection as leverage, wrapped her arms around me with a forced softness, then whispered in that teasing voice, "Let's see how much you miss me tonight." Like it was a dare. They used to work. They used to dig deep, make me question myself, make me scramble to win her back. But now, I just smiled gently and said, "Rest well," then walked past her and closed the bedroom door behind me. It wasn't attachment. It was clarity. She didn't know what to do with it. Her disappointment stopped landing. Her disapproval didn't shape my day. She would hurl accusations. "You care more about your job than your marriage." And I'd just listen without defending, not coldly, just neutrally, because her words weren't reflections of reality anymore. They were instruments of control losing their tune. Without my reactions, the performance fell flat. The spotlight dimmed. The audience had left the theater, and all that was left was a woman performing a play for herself. It started with her robe, the silk one she always wore on nights she wanted something. She draped herself across the arm of the sofa like she was posing for a magazine cover, glass of whiskey in one hand, playing our old jazz playlist from the Bluetooth speaker. I walked in carrying a basket of clean laundry, paused for only a moment, and said, "Evening," before setting the basket down and beginning to fold. I didn't make a comment about the robe. I didn't touch the whiskey. I didn't let the low lighting and curated mood pull me into a scene I hadn't agreed to. She shifted, clearly expecting a different response. A question, a compliment, a kiss. I gave her none, not because I was angry, but because I recognized the choreography. I'd seen this routine before: the robe, the drink, the sly references to the good old days, when we used to laugh over takeout and fall asleep on the couch. Back when I was easy to steer with the right combination of nostalgia and flirtation. But now it all felt staged, like someone reading from a script that no longer matched the scene. She brought out an old photo album the next evening, sliding it across the table while I prepped chicken breast for the next day's meals. "Remember this trip?" she asked, pointing to a faded picture of us at Lake Erie. I glanced down, smiled slightly, and said, "Yeah, weather was brutal that weekend," then went back to seasoning. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the page like she was waiting for something more. A spark, a story, a sigh. But I didn't give her one. I wasn't trying to be cold. I just wasn't interested in being drawn into memories used as tools. Love shouldn't feel like bait. She tried jokes next. Our old inside ones. Lines we used to laugh at late at night. Phrases that used to collapse us into each other. She said one while I was filling the blender, raising her eyebrow as if expecting me to finish it like I always had. I looked at her, polite, calm, and simply said, "Haven't heard that one in a while." Then turned the blender on and let the sound fill the room. None of it came with cruelty. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't building walls. I was simply done being lured by tactics dressed up as intimacy. It wasn't real connection. It was theater, and I had retired from the role she'd cast me in. I started sleeping on the couch some nights, not storming out, not slamming doors, just quietly carrying a blanket and setting up with a book. I even added a second pillow, not to make a point, not to send a message, but because I realized I liked the space. It was neutral ground, free of tension and expectation. The couch became a small sanctuary where I could breathe without walking on glass. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. She noticed. Of course, one night she asked, "Are you seriously planning to sleep out here again?" I looked up from my book and answered honestly, "Yeah, I sleep better here lately." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She just stood there for a moment, then walked away. There was no power in her performance anymore. I had removed the lever. There was no reaction to manipulate, no string to pull. I wasn't playing hard to get. I simply wasn't playing, and with each day that passed, the house felt different, lighter, as if the air had cleared, as if it was mine again. Not a stage for someone else's drama, not a place where I had to earn peace, but a home, quiet, honest, free. It was early, just after 6, and the house was still quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the soft clink of the spoon as I stirred my coffee. The light over the sink cast a dull glow across the counters, and I stood barefoot, steady, grounded in the moment. She walked in, rubbing her eyes, wrapped in her robe again, the same familiar robe she had worn through a dozen little performances over the years. I poured her a cup out of habit, placed it gently on the counter, and, as I did, I felt something in me settle. I didn't plan to speak. I didn't rehearse anything. But as she reached for the mug and gave that faint, practice sigh, the one she used when she wanted me to ask what was wrong, I looked at her and said it clear and low. "When you pull back to influence me, it doesn't make me move toward you. It cheapens everything." She paused, fingers still curled around the ceramic, eyes flicking up to meet mine. Her mouth pulled into a half-smile, the one she used when she wanted to shift the tone. "God, you're being dramatic," she said lightly, like we were joking. Like I hadn't just pulled the thread loose on something she didn't want unraveled. "No," I said calmly. "I'm being specific." The silence that followed landed like a stone in water. No ripples, just a heavy stillness. She didn't laugh again, didn't speak. She just looked at me, and I could see in her face the subtle calculations, the usual pivots she reached for when things didn't go her way. But nothing fit this moment. Her tactics, the patterns, they had been named out loud. And that changed everything. I didn't say anything else. I picked up my mug and left the kitchen. After that morning, something in the air between us changed. Not in a way that caused explosions or breakdowns, but in the way fog lifts and leaves you squinting in the light. I didn't explain myself anymore. I didn't offer updates about where I was going, or why I was home late, or what I was doing on a random Thursday after work. I just lived. Lunch with my brother on Wednesdays became routine again. The gym before sunrise wasn't a negotiation. Weekend hikes happened without discussion. Sometimes I drive out town for a few hours, walk through antique shops, sit at coffee counters alone, not because I was escaping, but because I had space to breathe and I was finally using it. She noticed, of course. She asked once, "Why are you always gone lately?" And I just said, "I'm not. I'm just not always here." No anger, no challenge, just truth. There were no more fights, because I stopped entering the arena. No more reward and punishment cycles, because I stopped chasing. I no longer played the husband-shaped puppet who danced for closeness. I wasn't cold. I was just done being molded. I didn't ask for permission, and I didn't announce my choices like declarations of independence. I simply took them, one after another. Small, consistent, unshakable moves. Each one a quiet reminder that my life belonged to me again. It didn't take long for her to realize the silence wasn't working. The cool distance she used to carve space between us had no edge anymore, no grip. I didn't respond with confusion, didn't try to mend the air. I let the silence be exactly what it was, quiet. When that didn't move me, she pivoted to guilt. One evening, she stood in the kitchen holding a photo of us from our anniversary dinner 2 years ago. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. "I don't even recognize us anymore," she said, waiting for me to look up from my laptop. I did, briefly, then returned to what I was reading. I wasn't dismissive, I was just done chasing ghosts. She layered it on after that. More sighs, more half-finished sentences, more glances loaded with implication. I didn't bite. Not because I didn't care, but because I wouldn't be pulled into a script I hadn't written. I wasn't going to be manipulated by sorrow dressed as sincerity. When guilt didn't land, she tried seduction again. The same approaches. Wine in the evening, leaning closer than usual when passing by, sudden playfulness that felt almost rehearsed. I met each moment with a smile and a nod, then went right back to folding laundry or preparing food. I wasn't withholding. I was just uninterested in theater. If connection was real, it didn't need to be performed. Then came the blame. She cornered me in the hallway after dinner one night, her voice rising with frustration. "You're punishing me," she said, arms crossed. "You think you're being mature, but you're just being cold." I looked at her, not angry, not defensive, and said, "I'm not cruel. I'm precise." That stopped her for a second. She stared like she didn't quite understand the language I was speaking. But I wasn't going to translate it into a tone that made her feel safe while I stayed suffocated. I'd done that for years. A few days later, she texted me a hotel reservation, an upscale resort 2 hours away, couples massage included, suite with a balcony view. Surprise weekend getaway. The message read, followed by a winking emoji. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "Looks nice," I wrote. "We can go when we solve what the trip is meant to hide." She didn't answer. Not right away. For the first time, she didn't have a tactic ready. The plan had been predictable. Distract with sparkle, blur the tension with luxury, wrap disconnection in the soft blanket of spa robes and soft jazz. But I wasn't starving for the illusion of peace. I was working for the real thing. That night, she stood in the doorway while I was organizing some receipts in my office. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice quieter than I'd heard in weeks. Not small, not manipulative, just uncertain. It was the first honest question she'd asked in a long time. I looked up at her and didn't hesitate. Partnership without performance. If you want me, want me. Don't price it. She didn't reply right away. There was no script for this. No backup plan. She'd run out of angles. And without someone to play against, the game began to starve. I wasn't withholding love. I was refusing to earn it like a prize. When she finally brought up counseling, it wasn't in that rehearsed tone she used when she wanted to appear cooperative. It didn't feel like damage control. There was no mention of optics, no talk about how it might look, no suggestion that we seemed off. She simply sat across from me one morning, quiet, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and said, "I think I need help connecting again, and I know I can't do it alone." I watched her carefully, not with suspicion, but with the same clarity I'd built up over the last few months. I didn't jump at the offer. I didn't flood with hope. I just nodded and said, "If you're ready to do the work, so am I." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it without hesitation or fear. Therapy wasn't a magical fix. There was no sweeping breakthrough that glued us back together. It was slow, clumsy, and sometimes exhausting. But it was honest. The counselor didn't let either of us hide behind polished words. She asked sharp questions. Sometimes Jennifer flinched, sometimes I did, but we kept showing up week after week. Jennifer cried during one session when she admitted she didn't know how to connect without trying to manage the outcome. That she'd grown up believing vulnerability was weakness, that if she didn't control the emotional tone of the room, she'd be swallowed by it. She said she used affection like a tool because she didn't know how else to feel safe. Her voice cracked when she said, "I thought I was being strategic. I didn't realize I was being cruel." There was no applause in that room. Just silence. But it was the right kind of silence. The kind that lets truth stretch out and settle. I didn't abandon the space I'd created for myself. I still hit the gym before work. Still hiked alone on weekends. Still shut off my phone when I needed distance. But now, those things weren't barriers between us. They were roots for me. Things that kept me grounded while we figured out what partnership actually meant. She stopped trying to draw me in with seduction or nostalgia. She stopped treating intimacy like a prize she could grant or revoke. And I noticed. Not because she said she'd changed, but because the game, the constant emotional maneuvering, was gone. She spoke plainly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with hesitation, but always without theater. The turning point wasn't a grand romantic moment. It was an afternoon after counseling, when we sat in the car, hands resting separately on our laps. I asked her plainly, "Do you want the marriage, or do you want control?" She didn't speak right away. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, and then, finally, with her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I want the marriage, and I'm willing to feel stupid learning how." I didn't smile. I didn't squeeze her hand. I just nodded because I believed her, not from her words, but from the space she'd finally stopped trying to control. That was what let me stay, not hope, not habit, just peace, a peace that wasn't perfect or poetic, but steady, real, and mine.